Mafia boss sees a black poor girl struggling to carry his disabled mother home. He instantly rushed over and then froze. Enzo Maresca was in the middle of a business meeting, the kind where business meant negotiating distribution rights with the Chicago outfit, while his hand rested casually near the Glock holstered beneath his tailored suit jacket. When his phone vibrated with an alert from his mother's medical tracker, heart rate elevated, location moving away from her care facility, his blood turned to ice. "We're done here," he said in Italian, standing abruptly. The outfit's underboss started to protest, but something in Enzo's expression, the deadly calm that his enemies had learned meant violence was seconds away, made the man reconsider. Enzo was already moving toward the door, his second-in-command Marco scrambling to follow. "Boss, let me send the crew." "No." The word came out like a gunshot. His mother, his mama, the one person in this God-forsaken world he'd sworn to protect, the one promise that mattered more than territory, more than money, more than the empire his father had bled to build. Are you new here? Subscribe so you don't miss more interesting stories like this one from us. New stories every day. How it started. The private dining room at Fermento's smelled like old money and older blood. Enzo Maresca sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone as he listened to Tommy, the knife Giordano, outline the outfit's proposal for Southside distribution territories. The old guard wanted 30%. Enzo was offering 15. Between them sat lawyers with briefcases and soldiers with barely concealed weapons. "Your father, God rest his soul, he understood respect," Tommy said, leaning back in his chair. "He understood that certain arrangements—" Enzo's phone vibrated against his chest. Once, twice. The specific pattern that overrode every setting, every silent mode, every meeting, no matter how critical. His hand moved to his jacket. The screen glowed with a single alert. Sophia Maresca, geofence breach, heart rate elevated. The room disappeared. The negotiations, Tommy's veiled threats, the delicate balance of power that had taken weeks to arrange, all of it became irrelevant static. "We're done here," Enzo said, standing so abruptly his chair scraped against marble. Tommy's face flushed red. "Sit down, Maresca. We're done." The words came out flat, final, with the kind of certainty that made Marco reach for his weapon and the outfit's soldiers tense in their seats. But it was Enzo's eyes that made Tommy swallow his protest. That particular emptiness, that deadly calm that preceded violence like silence before thunder. Marco was already at the door, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders in rapid Italian. "Boss, I've got 3 crews in that area. Let me—" "No." Enzo was moving, his long strides eating up the restaurant's corridor. "Get the car, now." "Boss, you can't just—" "Now, Marco." The drive was a blur of brake lights and honking horns. Marco drove while Enzo pulled up the tracker app, watching the small blue dot that represented his mother's medical bracelet move with agonizing slowness away from Sunrise Villa Care Facility. His father's voice echoed in his memory, weak from the cancer but still commanding. "Whatever happens to me, whatever happens to the business, you protect your mother. You hear me, Enzo? You protect Sophia." "Call the facility," Enzo ordered. Marco had already dialed. The director's voice came through the speaker, professional veneer cracking into panic as Marco identified them. "Mr. Maresca, there's been an unfortunate incident. Where is my mother?" The medical transport en route to her neurologist appointment experienced mechanical failure. In the process of transferring patients to a backup vehicle, there was some confusion. "Where is my mother?" "We're still trying to—" "You lost her." It wasn't a question. Enzo's voice had gone quiet, which everyone who knew him understood was infinitely more dangerous than shouting. "You lost a 72-year-old disabled woman in a snowstorm. Mr. Maresca, I assure you we have people searching. You have 30 minutes to explain to me how this happened before I have your facility shut down and every staff member there looking for new employment. Are we clear?" He ended the call. Marco glanced at him, then back at the road. "Boss, the tracker shows she's moving, on foot. Someone's with her." Enzo's jaw clenched. 3 miles from the facility in sub-zero temperatures. His mother couldn't walk unassisted on her best days. On her worst, she couldn't remember who he was. "Drive faster," he said. They found them 2 blocks from the shuttered Halsted Street CTA station, and the sight stopped Enzo's breath in his chest. A young black woman in a diner uniform was carrying his mother piggyback through the snow. Sophia's thin arms wrapped around the girl's neck, her silver hair dusted white with ice crystals. The woman's legs trembled with each step. Her waitress shoes, cheap, worn things that had no business in a Chicago winter, leaving uneven prints in the accumulating powder. But she kept moving, head down against the wind, breathing hard, refusing to stop. Marco barely had the car in park before Enzo was out, his men emerging with hands near their weapons because this made no sense. Nothing about this made sense, and his father had taught him that anything unexplainable was dangerous. The woman looked up, met his eyes, and didn't flinch. "Are you Enzo?" Her voice was raw, exhausted. "Your mother kept saying you'd find her, that Enzo would come." His mother's head lifted from the stranger's shoulder. "Enzo," Sophia breathed, and her eyes were clear, actually clear, recognizing him. "This angel found me. Everyone else left, but she wouldn't leave me." "Ma," Enzo said, his voice cracking on the word. Then to the woman, "Put her down, carefully." "I've got her." The girl's chin lifted slightly, protective despite the armed men surrounding her, despite the obvious wealth in Enzo's tailored coat and the danger radiating from his crew. She adjusted her grip, gentle, and slowly lowered Sophia to her feet while Marco rushed forward with a thermal blanket. Enzo caught his mother as her legs buckled, gathering her against his chest. She felt impossibly fragile, and the rage that flooded through him, at the facility, at the incompetent transport company, at himself for not being there, threatened to choke him. "What happened?" he demanded. The woman, girl really, she couldn't be more than 23, wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently now that she wasn't carrying Sophia's weight. "I was walking home from my shift at Lou Mitchell's, found her crying in the parking lot off Roosevelt. The transport van was empty, engine dead. I tried the emergency button on her bracelet, kept pressing it, but nobody answered. So I looked at her medical tag, saw the address, and started walking." "You carried her." It wasn't a question. Behind the girl, Enzo could see the abandoned wheelchair, its wheels locked up with ice, maybe half a mile back. "The chair froze up after 2 blocks, she said simply. "She couldn't walk. I couldn't leave her." Marco was already pulling out his wallet, thick with hundreds. Enzo reached for his own. "How much do you want?" Something flickered across her face. Not offense exactly, but something close to disappointment. "I don't want your money." Everyone wants money. "I didn't do it for a reward." She was shivering so hard her teeth chattered, but her voice stayed steady. "I did it because she needed help, because that's what you do when someone needs help." Enzo stared at her. In his world, everything had a price. Loyalty, silence, protection, everything could be bought or sold. But this stranger looked at him like he'd insulted her by suggesting otherwise. "Enzo," his mother's hand reached out, grasping the girl's frozen fingers. "Promise me. Promise you'll thank this girl properly." "I will, Ma. I promise." He looked at the stranger again, really looked. Grease stains on her uniform, worn shoes, hands red and cracked from cold and hard work. "What's your name?" "Grace," she said. "Grace Eric." Enzo couldn't stop seeing her face. 3 days after the snow, after he'd settled his mother back into the facility with new staff and new protocols and threats that would ensure nothing like this ever happened again, Grace Eric's expression haunted him. That look of disappointment when he'd offered money, like he'd fundamentally misunderstood something basic about the world. Marco handed him the folder on Thursday morning. "Everything you asked for." Grace Michelle Eric, 23, morning shift at Lou Mitchell's, lunch shift at a sandwich place in the Loop, weekend nights bartending in Pilsen. Basement apartment in Inglewood, rent 3 months behind. Nursing school dropout after her mother died 2 years ago.
Sent $200 a month to her grandmother in Biloxi. Clean record, not even a parking ticket, though that might be because she didn't own a car. She's nobody, boss, Marco said carefully. Just a girl working too hard for not enough money. That was the problem. Grace Eric was exactly nobody by Marco's standards, by his father's standards, by the standards of the world Enzo inhabited. But she'd carried his mother 3 miles through a blizzard and refused payment for it. He found himself at Lou Mitchell's on Friday morning, sliding into a booth in her section before he could question the impulse. She recognized him immediately. Her eyes widened slightly before her professional smile locked into place. "Coffee?" she asked, pot already tilting toward his cup. "And a minute of your time." "I'm working. I can wait." Grace glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him. Something flickered across her face. She'd Googled him, he realized. She knew exactly who Enzo Maresca was, what he did, why men in expensive suits didn't just show up in diners without reason. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," she said quietly. "I'm not selling anything. I'm asking you to dinner." "Why?" The directness of it caught him off guard. In his world, people danced around intentions, spoke in coded language, negotiated through intermediaries. Grace just asked. "Because I want to thank you properly, like I promised my mother I would." "You could have sent flowers." Grace. Her name felt strange in his mouth, too soft for the hard edges of his life. "Please, one meal. You pick the place." She studied him for a long moment, and Enzo realized with uncomfortable clarity that she was deciding whether he was dangerous, whether this was some kind of trap. "Giannotti's, 7 o'clock, the one on Taylor Street." "I know it. Small place, family-owned, nothing to do with his operations, neutral ground." "And Mr. Maresca, I looked you up. I know who you are." She leaned closer, voice dropping. "So let's be clear. I'm agreeing to dinner, not to whatever else you might think comes with it." That night, across a checkered tablecloth while the tired grandmother served them pasta, Enzo tried to explain his life, the family business, the expectations, the weight of his father's legacy, pressing down like a physical thing. He expected her to make excuses and leave, call a cab, never speak to him again. Instead, Grace set down her fork and asked, "If you hate what you do so much, why do you keep doing it?" The question hit him like a physical blow. No one had ever asked him that. Not Marco, not his mother, not the therapist the family lawyer had suggested after his father died. Everyone just assumed this was who Enzo Maresca was, what Enzo Maresca did. "Because it's what I'm good at," he said finally. "That's not an answer." Grace's eyes held his unflinching. "Being good at something doesn't mean you have to keep doing it, especially if it's killing you." Enzo sat back, something cracking open in his chest that he didn't have words for. "Who are you, Grace Eric?" he asked. "Just someone who thinks you're better than you believe you are, and I don't even know you yet." It started with one visit. Grace showed up at his penthouse the following Sunday with a canvas bag full of Tupperware containers and a worn copy of Dante's Inferno in Italian that she'd found at a used bookstore. "Your mother mentioned she missed hearing Italian," Grace explained when Marco tried to turn her away at the door, "and I figured she might be tired of facility food." Sophia's face when she saw Grace was the kind of joy Enzo hadn't seen since before the stroke. His mother actually clapped her hands together like a child, lucid and present in a way that made his chest ache. By the third Sunday, Enzo stopped pretending he had other places to be. He'd find himself cutting meetings short, ignoring Marco's pointed looks as he checked his watch during negotiations. He'd arrive home to find Grace and his mother on the leather couch, Grace reading poetry and halting Italian while Sophia corrected her pronunciation with gentle patience. "Your accent is terrible," Sophia would say, laughing, "but your heart is good. That matters more." Grace brought pane e panelle from a Sicilian bakery his mother loved but hadn't mentioned in years. She made collard greens with Italian sausage, some beautiful collision of her Mississippi roots and his mother's Palermo childhood. She asked Sophia about the old country, about coming to America, about raising a son in a world that demanded hardness. "He was such a sweet boy," Sophia said one Sunday, her fingers wrapped around Grace's hand. "Always drawing pictures of buildings. He'd design whole cities on notebook paper, every detail perfect." She looked at Enzo, who'd frozen in the doorway with his coat still on. Tell her, Enzo. Tell her what you want it to be. Ma, that was a long time ago. An architect, Sophia continued, ignoring him. He was going to build beautiful things. Then his father... Her voice trailed off, the light in her eyes dimming. Grace turned to look at him, really look at him, and Enzo felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the gun under his jacket or the blood on his family name. It's not too late, Grace said quietly. It's not too late to be who you wanted to be. I'm 43 years old, Grace. I run a criminal empire. I'm not... You're 43 years old and you're alive. That means you still get to choose. Every single day you get to choose. That night, after Grace left and his mother fell asleep in the guest room he'd furnished for her weekend visits, Enzo stood on his terrace overlooking the city. Chicago sprawled before him, glittering and cold, sectioned into territories he controlled through violence and fear. The South Side docks, the Pilsen warehouses, the distribution networks that made him wealthy and despised in equal measure. He pulled out his phone, opened a browser, and typed words he hadn't thought about in 28 years. Architecture programs, Chicago, adults. The search results glowed in the darkness. Roosevelt University had a program. Evening classes. He could finish his undergraduate degree, then maybe... Enzo closed the browser, shoved the phone back in his pocket. It was a stupid fantasy. Men like him didn't get redemption arcs. They got prison sentences or bullets. But later, lying in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Grace's words. You still get to choose. What if she was right?
The shift happened so gradually, Enzo didn't notice until he was already in too deep. Grace's number became the first one he called in the morning. Her opinion became the one that mattered when Marco presented new opportunities, new territories, new ways to expand. Her absence became the thing that made his penthouse feel empty instead of peaceful. He was falling in love with her, and it terrified him more than any territorial war ever had. Grace saw through everything, every carefully constructed wall, every deflection, every attempt to hide behind his reputation. When he talked about business, she asked about the people affected. When he justified decisions with, "That's how things work," she'd tilt her head and ask, "But is that how things should work?" She was falling too. He could see it in the way she touched his face when she thought he wasn't paying attention, like she was trying to memorize him, in how she'd wait up when he had late meetings, pretending to study, but really just wanting to hear his voice before she slept. "You're not what people say you are," she told him one night, curled against his chest in his bed. "You're so much lonelier than anyone knows." "I'm a monster, Grace. Don't forget that." "You're a man who was taught to be a monster. That's different." Then Marco showed him the surveillance photos. Russian crew, Volkov's people, parked outside Grace's apartment in Englewood, outside Lou Mitchell's, following her CTA route to her bartending shift. "They're sending a message, boss," Marco said carefully. "They know about her." Enzo's hands clenched into fists. "Move her, tonight. The building on Wells Street, the secure one, and I want a protection detail, round the clock." Grace hated it. Hated the bodyguards trailing her to class, the restricted movements, the way her life suddenly wasn't her own. But she wasn't stupid. She understood what loving Enzo Maresca meant, what world she'd stepped into. The near miss came on a Tuesday. Russian crew followed her protection detail, tried to box them in near the Ashland exit. Marco's men got her out, but it was close. Too close. Enzo found her in the secure apartment, shaking but trying to hide it. He pulled her into his arms and felt her finally break, sobs muffled against his chest. "You're quitting," he said. "All of it. The diner, the bar." "Enzo, I need to work. I have bills, my grandmother." "I'll handle it. All of it." He pulled back, cupped her face in his hands. "Go back to school. Finish your nursing degree. Let me give you that." "I'm not a charity case. You're the woman I love," he said, and watched her eyes widen because he'd never said it out loud before. "Let me protect you, please." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Then, on one condition, anything. You use your power for something good, not just protection, not just control, actually good. Her voice strengthened. You own half the South Side, Enzo. You could fund after-school programs, scholarship funds, job training. You could stop just taking from these neighborhoods and start giving back. Enzo, that's my condition. She stood firm, despite the fear still bright in her eyes. I'll let you pay for school. I'll live in your cage, but only if you promise me you'll try to be the man I see when I look at you. Enzo looked at this woman who'd carried his mother through a blizzard, who saw past everything he was to everything he could be, and realized she was offering him something more valuable than any territory. She was offering him a reason to change. I promise, he said.
The call came while Enzo was in a meeting with his accountant, discussing the preliminary plans for a community scholarship fund. Grace's idea, her condition, the promise he'd made. Marco burst through the door, face ashen. Boss, we lost her. Everything stopped. Time, breath, thought, all of it suspended in the single second between understanding and action. What do you mean you lost her? Outside Malcolm X College, campus security said they were loading equipment, blocking the usual pickup zone. The detail repositioned, and in that 30-second window, Marco's voice cracked. 3 vehicles, military precision. They took out both guards, non-lethal. They wanted her alive. Enzo's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered without speaking. Enzo Maresca. The voice was thickly accented, Russian. Dmitry Volkov. I have something that belongs to you. If you've hurt her. She's unharmed, for now. Volkov's tone was almost apologetic, like he regretted the necessity of this. But her continued health depends entirely on your cooperation. The South Side ports, the distribution networks through Pilsen and back of the yards, I want them all. You have 72 hours to transfer operations, or the girl dies. We'll be in touch with details. The line went dead. Enzo's world contracted to a single point of white-hot rage. Marco was already on his phone, calling in every soldier, every associate, every man who owed the Maresca family loyalty or fear. Within an hour, his war room was full of captains ready for blood. We hit every Russian operation in the city, Marco said, finger stabbing at a map. Burn them out. Make it so costly Volkov has no choice but to give her back. We take the lieutenant's family, another captain suggested, even the playing field. Enzo stared at the map, at the territories outlined in marker, at the chess pieces of violence his father had taught him to play with. His hand moved toward the table, ready to give the order that would paint Chicago red. Then Grace's voice, clear as if she were in the room. Violence just makes more violence, Enzo. When does it end? His father would have already started, would have sent bodies back to Volkov wrapped in Russian flags, would have made examples so brutal the city would talk about it for decades. His father had built an empire on that kind of fear, that willingness to go further than anyone else dared. His father had also died alone in a hospital room, his empire held together by terror, surrounded by people who feared him but didn't love him, who stayed because leaving meant death, not because staying meant anything good. Boss, Marco's voice pulled him back. What are your orders? Enzo looked around the room at faces hungry for war, at men ready to kill on his command. He thought about Grace, terrified somewhere in a Russian safe house, praying he'd come for her. He thought about his mother asking him to be better, about Sunday dinners and architecture dreams, and the scholarship fund paperwork still sitting on his desk. Stand down, he said quietly. What? I said stand down. Enzo's voice strengthened. No retaliation, no hits. We don't touch their families, their operations, nothing. Boss, they took Grace. They're going to... I know what they're going to do. Enzo met Marco's eyes. But burning Chicago down won't get her back alive. It'll just give Volkov an excuse to kill her and blame it on the chaos. Then what do we do? Enzo pulled out his phone, stared at Volkov's number. His father's voice echoed in his head, calling him weak, telling him sentiment was for corpses. But his father was dead, and Grace was alive, and maybe, just maybe, there was a way to win this that didn't require becoming the monster everyone expected. Get me everything on Volkov, Enzo said. Not his operations, him, his family, his debts, his fears, what he wants beyond territory. He looked up at his assembled captains. I'm going to negotiate. The abandoned meatpacking plant on the industrial corridor still smelled like blood and rust, even though it had been closed for a decade. Enzo walked in alone as instructed, hands visible, no weapon, though Marco and 20 men waited 2 blocks away, ready to move if this went wrong. Grace was tied to a chair in the center of the empty floor, duct tape over her mouth, eyes wide but defiant, alive, unharmed. Relief hit Enzo so hard he almost staggered. Dmitry Volkov stood behind her, flanked by 8 armed men. The Russian was older than Enzo expected, late 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of tired in his eyes that came from decades of violence. "Enzo Maresca," Volkov said, accent thick but English clear. "You come alone, either very brave or very stupid." "I came to talk." "There is nothing to talk about. You give me the ports, the distribution networks, or she dies. Simple." "It's not simple at all." Enzo took a step forward. Rifles shifted, tracking him. "You kill her, I go to war. We both know how that ends. Maybe you win, maybe I win, but either way, we lose half our operations and get federal attention neither of us wants. The FBI would love an excuse to bring RICO charges while we're distracted bleeding each other." "So you surrender?" "I'm offering a partnership." Enzo kept his voice steady, though every instinct screamed to rush to Grace, to get her away from these men. "Not a surrender, a transition. You want the shipping routes? I'll give you access, but as legitimate business, not criminal enterprise." Volkov laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think I'm stupid? There's no profit in legitimate." "There's more profit than you think with none of the risk." Enzo pulled papers from his coat slowly, let Volkov's men check them. "I've been looking at the numbers. Legal imports, using the connections and infrastructure we already have, we could exceed current criminal earnings within 2 years. No federal heat, no constant territorial wars, no looking over our shoulders." "Why would you do this?" "Because I'm tired." The admission felt like bleeding. Tired of violence. Tired of what this life costs. I have a woman I love, a mother who's dying by inches. I want something left of me that isn't just fear and blood money. Volkov studied him for a long moment. Behind him, Grace's eyes were locked on Enzo's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You give me equal partnership, 50-50 on legitimate operations?" 60-40, Maresca majority, but you get seats on the board, real power, real profit. Your children inherit a business, not a war. He paused. "I looked into you, Dmitry. You have 3 kids. Your daughter's at Northwestern studying medicine. Your sons are in high school. You think they want to live the way we've lived?" Something flickered across Volkov's face. Pain, recognition, the weight of his own choices. "My father would call this weakness," Volkov said quietly. "My father died alone, hated by everyone, including his own son." Enzo met the Russian's eyes. "I don't want that legacy. Do you?" The silence stretched, heavy as death. Grace's breathing was the only sound, quick and frightened through her nose. Volkov's men waited for orders, to shoot, to stand down, to start a war that would consume them all. Finally, Volkov lowered his weapon. "We discussed terms. But first," he gestured, and one of Volkov's men cut Grace's bonds. She ran to Enzo, and he caught her, held her like she was the only thing keeping him standing. Maybe she was. "You're insane," Volkov said, but he was smiling slightly. "Completely insane." "Probably," Enzo agreed. "But I'm also right." They walked out together. Not as enemies, not quite as friends, but as 2 men choosing a different path than the one their fathers walked. For the first time in Enzo's life, he had won, without spilling blood.
The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took 5 years of careful negotiation, of walking the razor's edge between his old life and the one he was building. 5 years of federal prosecutors who didn't trust him, of former allies who called him a traitor, of sleepless nights wondering if he was destroying everything his father built or finally building something worth keeping. Enzo met with the FBI in a downtown office that smelled like burnt coffee and suspicion. He gave them names, locations, intelligence on human trafficking networks his father had refused to touch, but other families ran without hesitation. In exchange, immunity. The chance to walk away clean, or as clean as a man like him could ever be. "Why should we believe you've changed?" the prosecutor asked, skeptical eyes boring into him across the table. "Because I have something to lose now," Enzo said simply, "and I'd rather build something than watch it all burn." He went back to school at 43, sitting in Roosevelt University classrooms with students half his age, finishing the business degree he'd abandoned at 20 when his father pulled him into the family. Marco thought he was crazy. Grace bought him a backpack and kissed him before his first class like he was heading off to kindergarten. The shipping company transformed slowly. Connections and infrastructure repurposed for legal imports. Maresca Holdings became one of the Midwest's largest importers of Italian goods, olive oil, wine, textiles. Volkov's operation folded in alongside, the Russian bringing Eastern European markets Enzo couldn't access alone. The profit margins were thinner than drug running, but they were clean, sustainable. His accountant could file taxes without lying. He married Grace on a Sunday in early spring, Sophia in the front row wearing her best dress, lucid enough to smile and cry and hold Grace's hand during the vows. It was the last good day before dementia took his mother fully, before she stopped recognizing him, before she became a body without the woman he'd known inside it. The Sophia and Grace Foundation started small. One community center in Englewood, offering after-school programs and job training. Then another in Pilsen. Then back of the yards. Grace ran the health clinics while finishing her nursing degree. Enzo used his connections, the legitimate ones now, to bring in funding, resources, opportunities to neighborhoods his family had once bled dry. Former soldiers in his organization faced choices. Marco transitioned into head of security for Maresca Holdings, trading his gun for a clipboard and a salary with benefits. Others found construction work, used their organizational skills in legitimate businesses, became men their children didn't have to lie about at school. Some couldn't make the change. Tommy left for Vegas, unable to give up the old ways. 3 others ended up in federal prison on charges Enzo's cooperation hadn't covered. 2 died in territorial disputes with families who saw the Maresca transition as weakness to exploit. But enough made it. Enough transformed alongside him that when Enzo looked around the boardroom of Maresca Holdings 5 years later, he saw men who'd once killed on his orders, now arguing about shipping schedules and profit margins. Sophia died on a Tuesday, Grace holding one hand and Enzo the other. Dementia having stolen everything but her physical presence months before. At the funeral, Enzo stood before a church full of people, some who'd feared his father, some who'd worked for him, some whose lives the foundation had changed, and realized his mother had given him one final gift. She'd lived long enough to see him become someone worth grieving for the right reasons. Enzo Maresca was 73 years old when he stood in front of the 10th Sophia Maresca Community Center, his hand clasped in Grace's, watching hundreds of people gather for the dedication ceremony. His hair had gone silver, his body slower than it once was, but his eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been in those violent years when he'd ruled through fear instead of building through hope. The South Side had changed. The community center rose where an abandoned warehouse once stood, all glass of light and possibility. Around them stood people whose lives the foundation had touched. Teenagers in college sweatshirts who'd gotten scholarships, families holding keys to homes they'd bought through the affordable housing program, ex-offenders in suits who'd found second chances through job training and placement services. Grace squeezed his hand. She was 60 now, still beautiful, still the woman who'd carried his mother through snow and asked him impossible questions about who he wanted to be. She ran the foundation's network of health clinics, her nursing degree finally completed at 48. Their children, 2 daughters and a son, worked alongside them, carrying forward a legacy that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with redemption. They'd buried Sophia 28 years ago, Marco 10 years back, peacefully in his sleep, after a retirement spent fishing in Wisconsin. Dmitry Volkov just last year,
his children running the legitimate import business they'd built together. The old world was gone, and Enzo outlived most of it. A young black woman approached, maybe 18, holding an acceptance letter like it was made of gold. "Mr. and Mrs. Maresca, I wanted to thank you. The scholarship? I got into Northwestern, pre-med. I'm going to be a doctor." Grace hugged her, fierce and proud. "You're going to be amazing." Enzo watched the girl walk away, her whole future spreading out before her like a map with no dead ends, no territories marked in blood, no choices made by violence and fear. He thought about another young woman, decades ago, struggling through snow with his mother on her back, refusing money because kindness wasn't something you did for reward. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, following his gaze. "That night," he said, "when you carried my mother home, you asked me why I kept doing what I was doing if I hated it so much. I remember." "I didn't have an answer then. I do now." Enzo turned to face his wife, this woman who'd saved his mother and then saved him. "Because you showed me that who I'd been didn't have to be who I was. That the most powerful thing you can do is choose every single day to be better than you were yesterday." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Enzo, I was my father's son. I built an empire on fear. I hurt people." He looked around at the community center, at the lives being changed, at the legacy they'd built together. "But then you walked into my life carrying my mother, and you asked me to be better. And I chose you. I chose this. Every single day for 30 years, I chose this." "We chose this," Grace corrected gently. "We chose each other." From inside the community center, Enzo could hear children laughing, music playing, life happening in a space that once held only darkness and abandonment. His phone buzzed, probably his daughter checking in from the housing development project on the west side, or his son calling about the new job training facility they were breaking ground on next month. The work never ended, but it was good work. Work that built instead of destroyed. Work that gave people chances instead of taking them away. Work that meant when Enzo Maresca finally died, his obituary would talk about community centers and scholarships and lives changed, not territories controlled and enemies eliminated. "Thank you," he said to Grace, the inadequate words for everything she'd given him. "For seeing something in me worth saving." Grace smiled, the same smile that had disarmed him in that diner 30 years ago. "You saved yourself, Enzo. I just asked the right question." They stood together as the ceremony began. Two people who chose love over violence, redemption over revenge, and built something that would outlast them both. It was enough. It was everything.